In the heart of Willow Crest Lane, a winding street paved in neat gray stones, stood rows of tastefully identical houses. Each front yard was uniformly manicured, with flower beds of identical blossoms in pastel hues. The symmetrical perfection was no accident. Hillside Oak Community, a private development in the American suburbs, had an active homeowners association, HOA, that regulated everything from fence height to mailbox style. While many residents valued this tidy environment, the rigid culture sometimes left little room for personal expression or spontaneous kindness. At the center of this rigid order was Annabeth Dawson, often called Karen behind her back, and sometimes even to her face, to her grudging acceptance. Officially, Karen served as the HOA's vice president, though she rarely hesitated to insert herself into roles well beyond her station. She was a woman in her mid-50s, with a crisp bob haircut and a wardrobe full of pastel slacks. Neighbors observed her march down the sidewalks at dawn, clutching a notepad where she jotted infractions, an unapproved garden gnome, a child's scooter left visible, or a flower variety too bold for the HOA's subdued palate. Karen was notorious for her catchphrase, "That's not in line with our standards." She used it against everything from painted planters to kids' chalk drawings. She took particular offense to bright or unusual colors that jarred the uniform aesthetic she revered. On more than one occasion, she'd quietly rearranged or disposed of neighbors' property, rationalizing it as a necessary measure for preserving Hillside Oak Community's property values. Even the HOA president, a mild retiree named Robert Everly, seemed powerless to curb Karen's zeal. Most neighbors, keen to avoid conflict, complied with her endless stream of suggestions and citations. Some rationalized that if the lawns and fences looked nice enough, the hassle might be worthwhile. Others, tired of battling, simply gave in. But Karen's sense of authority seemed to expand each time she bullied someone into submission. Yet no one realized the extent of her capacity for cruelty until she set her sights on the assistive walker belonging to a young child in the neighborhood. At the far end of Willow Crest Lane, in a beige two-story home, lived Marisol Green and her 7-year-old daughter, Bethany. Bethany had been born with mild cerebral palsy. She could move around with minimal assistance most days, but over longer distances or uneven ground, she needed support. Her parents had bought her a cheerful, bright pink pediatric walker, custom designed to help her navigate sidewalks and neighborhood paths safely. The color was Bethany's choice. Pink was her favorite. She loved the way it popped against the greenery and described the walker as her mobile friend. Despite her challenges, Bethany was a spirited child. She delighted in exploring the community's grassy areas, greeting neighbors, and feeding ducks at the small pond near the subdivision's entrance. Marisol often accompanied her on short strolls to watch the koi fish that sometimes swam near the pond's edge. These daily outings became treasured moments of mother-daughter bonding, with Bethany pushing her bright walker ahead of her, giggling whenever a duck quacked. Most neighbors found Bethany's presence charming. Several people waved or said hello, occasionally praising her decorated walker, which Bethany had personalized with colorful stickers. Yet, from the corner of her eye, Marisol noticed Karen's less appreciative stares. More than once, Karen had commented, in that tight-lipped way of hers, that the walker clashed with the neighborhood's neutral color scheme. At first, Marisol assumed it was just idle talk. After all, who would deny a child the freedom to choose a bright color for her medical device? Bethany remained mostly oblivious to Karen's annoyance. In her innocence, she believed everyone in the neighborhood was supportive of her mobility needs. She even tried to wave at Karen once or twice, though Karen usually offered only a curt nod in return. Little did Bethany suspect the hostility that simmered behind that forced politeness. The tension grew one Saturday afternoon when Karen, on her usual inspection rounds, spotted Bethany and Marisol feeding ducks by the pond. The bright pink walker rested on the grassy bank near them. Karen paused, frowning at the flash of pink in an otherwise subdued vista of muted grays, tans, and greens. She marched over, arms folded. "Marisol," she said by way of greeting, "I've been meaning to talk to you about that contraption." She nodded toward the pink walker. Marisol's guard went up. "Bethany's walker? Is there a problem?" Karen pressed her lips into a tight line. "It's not the device itself, but the color. Hillside Oak community has guidelines for external appearances, and that bright pink is, well, quite distracting. Marisol's jaw dropped. You're joking. Bethany glanced up with innocent curiosity, hugging the walker's handle. Mommy, what's wrong? Marisol forced a reassuring smile. Nothing, sweetie. We're just talking. Karen continued as though Bethany weren't present. Now, no one wants to restrict a child from using necessary equipment. But perhaps you could get a less offensive color? Maybe a beige or white. Something that blends in better with the environment. Her tone was calm, almost condescending. Marisol shook her head in disbelief. A child's mobility device isn't a lawn ornament. She needs it. And pink is her favorite color. I understand, Karen replied, her voice brimming with forced sympathy. But we must consider the overall aesthetic. People come to Hillside Oak for peace, not jarring neon shades. Then she pivoted, as though the matter was decided. I'll mention it at the next HOA meeting. We can see if we can officially recommend less obtrusive colors for all assistive devices. Marisol's cheeks flamed with indignation. You do whatever you must, Karen. But we're not painting over it. Karen gave a brisk nod, then walked off. Though the exchange had been brief, it rattled Marisol. She comforted Bethany, who sensed the tension despite not fully understanding Karen's hostility. In the following days, Marisol shared the incident with a few close neighbors. They were horrified that Karen would fixate on a disabled child's walker. Yet none were entirely surprised. Karen had a history of callousness. True to her word, Karen brought up the walker color problem at the next HOA meeting. It took place in the community clubhouse, a low-slung building near the neighborhood's entrance. Attendance hovered around 30 residents, most of whom found the evening gatherings dull, usually focused on budgets, landscaping, or the upkeep of communal benches. But Karen's agenda item about restricting bright medical devices caught people's attention. Whispers of disbelief and outrage flickered through the small crowd. Karen stood at the podium, flipping through a binder. We've had a complaint about, let's call it an extremely colorful device near the pond. While we respect individual needs, the board might consider guidelines encouraging neutral hues for items visible on community property. This is about maintaining consistent aesthetics. Some residents openly gaped. One older gentleman, Mr. Hogan, cleared his throat. Wait a minute. Are you talking about that little girl's walker? Karen's expression remained neutral. We can't name specific residents, of course, but I believe many share concerns about garish items. Bright pink is hardly appropriate for a well-manicured environment. A murmur of protests rose. Mrs. Timms, a grandmother of 3, spoke up. It's outrageous to single out a child's walker because it's pink. She has every right to choose the color. Another person added, this is a medical necessity, not a yard gnome. Show some humanity. Karen's mouth formed a tight line. We're simply discussing potential guidelines. The neighborhood invests a lot in maintaining uniformity. If bright items become the norm, we risk losing the prestige people pay for. From the front of the room, Robert Everly, the HOA president, coughed gently. Karen, maybe this is a bit extreme. Medical devices are personal. Perhaps we should consider exceptions. Karen, though outnumbered, didn't relent. She insisted on a formal vote for an advisory note, urging neutral colors for medical accessories. The board, uneasy with the backlash, tabled the motion indefinitely. After the meeting, Karen wore an expression that suggested she still felt right, while the rest of the room buzzed with disapproval. Some neighbors left in disgust, lamenting the day the HOA had drifted so far from compassion. Others exchanged worried glances. Karen rarely gave up once she latched onto a vendetta. Tension simmered over the subsequent weeks. Whenever Marisol walked with Bethany's pink walker, she caught Karen's glare from across the street. The child, oblivious to the politics, simply enjoyed the freedom to explore. Yet Marisol couldn't shake the sense that Karen was planning something more aggressive. She tried to remain calm, reminding herself that no official rule had been passed about the walker's color. Still, the repeated disapproving stares kept her on edge. One evening, while Bethany slept, Marisol confided in her closest friend, Heather Williams, about her fears. I can't believe an HOA official would stoop so low. But Karen's obsessed with controlling everything, and I'm worried she'll escalate. Heather nodded sympathetically over their shared mug of tea. I've heard stories. She once confiscated a child's soccer net because it was too bright. The family found it tossed behind a hedge. She might do something similar with Bethany's walker. Marisol felt a chill. That walker is crucial for my daughter's mobility. She'd be devastated if something happened to it. Heather reached across the table, squeezing Marisol's hand. Then I suggest we watch each other's backs. If you see or hear anything suspicious, let me know. We can also talk to the HOA president about increased vigilance. They agreed to stay alert. Meanwhile, a few sympathetic neighbors assured Marisol they'd keep an eye out whenever Bethany was out strolling. This quiet alliance gave Marisol a small measure of comfort. She hoped it would be enough to deter Karen from any rash action. Little did she realize how determined and cruel Karen could be when she believed the neighborhood's visual harmony was at stake. The pond at Hillside Oak Community was a centerpiece of its marketing brochure, a shimmering body of water with a modest walking path that meandered around willow trees. Ducks and koi fish swam amid lily pads. Families often visited to snap photos or relax at the wooden benches. The pond was also Bethany's favorite place to watch the fish darting in the shallows. On a late Friday afternoon, Marisol picked Bethany up from school and suggested a quick trip to the pond before dinner. The child beamed, eagerly grasping her pink walker. They strolled down the path, occasionally pausing when Bethany wanted to rest or admire a particularly fat duck waddling by. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the water's surface with a golden hue. They reached a bench near the water's edge, where Bethany parked her walker close by. She then cautiously stepped toward the pond's edge to toss a few bits of bread to the fish, with Marisol steadying her from behind. Their laughter danced across the ripples. Marisol was so focused on Bethany, she failed to notice a figure approaching from behind. Karen, walking at a brisk clip. By the time Marisol turned, Karen was within a few yards, face set with cold determination. She didn't greet them. Instead, her gaze zeroed in on the neon pink walker, which stood out vibrantly against the green grass. Before Marisol could speak, Karen hissed, "That monstrosity again? Haven't you considered repainting it?" Marisol bristled. "I told you my daughter likes pink. It's her walker, not community property." Karen's lip curled. "It offends the view. We have families who come here for scenic photos, not a jarring eyesore." She swept her arm dismissively. Marisol felt anger flare. "Keep your opinions to yourself. Bethany needs that walker to move. You have no right." Suddenly, Bethany let out a small cry from the pond's edge. She had turned around, concerned by the commotion. Marisol started to step away from Karen to assist her daughter, but in that moment, Karen lunged for the walker. "What are you doing?" Marisol shouted, voice rising in alarm. But Karen gripped the bright pink frame, face twisted in annoyance. With a vicious yank, Karen hoisted the walker and marched a few steps to the pond's rim. Then, with a jerk, she flung it outward. The pink frame flew through the air, hitting the water's surface with a heavy splash that sent ripples across the pond. The walker began sinking, part of it bobbing as water gurgled around it. Marisol froze in shock, her mind unable to process what she'd just witnessed. Bethany gasped, eyes wide, tears welling. Karen, meanwhile, brushed her hands together as though ridding herself of dirt. "There," she said, voice almost calm. "That contraption offends my view." For a moment, time seemed suspended. Marisol stood rooted to the spot, heart thudding in her chest. Then, adrenaline surged. "You monster!" she screamed, rushing toward the pond's edge. She could see the walker sinking, half submerged in murky water. Bethany began to cry in earnest, clinging to her mother's arm. Karen stepped back, as if avoiding the frantic splashes. "Don't overreact. Now maybe you'll consider a more appropriate color." Marisol whirled, rage and disbelief mingling in her eyes. "Stay away from my daughter." She scanned the nearby area for help. Two joggers on the path, having witnessed the scene, ran over, gasping at the sight of the sinking walker. One, a young man named Carlos, didn't hesitate. He kicked off his shoes, waded into the pond, and grabbed the nearly submerged frame. Algae and water spilled from the pink metal tubes. With effort, he dragged the walker to the shore. A small crowd began to gather. Heather, who lived only a few houses away, arrived breathless. "Oh God, Marisol, what happened?" She kneeled beside the soaked walker, which was now muddy and dripping. Bethany, trembling, reached out to touch her beloved device, tears sliding down her cheeks. Marisol's voice shook as she stared at Karen. You threw my child's walker into the water. She needs this to stand and walk. You realize how cruel that is." Karen pursed her lips, as though mildly inconvenienced. "Let's calm down. It can be cleaned, can't it? And next time, do consider a color that blends in." Shocked gasps rippled through the bystanders. Several people confronted Karen, calling her actions disgusting, inhumane. A few whipped out cell phones to record the aftermath. But Karen, maintaining her composure, muttered something about the exaggerated reaction and strode off, ignoring the calls to stop. The crowd parted, unsure whether to physically restrain her. She left behind outrage, confusion, and a broken pink walker leaking pond water. That evening, the Green household was filled with a somber air. Marisol had spent hours trying to clean and dry Bethany's walker. Some parts had rusted almost instantly upon contact with the pond's murky water, and one support was bent, likely from Karen's forceful toss. Though salvageable in theory, the walker would never be the same. More pressing was the emotional toll on Bethany. She sat quietly in a kitchen chair, tears dried up, but eyes vacant. When the phone rang, Marisol picked up to hear Heather's voice. "I've been fielding calls from neighbors all evening. People are furious, Marisol. Several folks saw Karen do it, or at least saw her with the walker. They're outraged, demanding the HOA take action, and many want to help you get Bethany a replacement." Marisol's voice broke. That's so kind. But I'm terrified for Bethany. She's traumatized." Heather paused. "I know, but maybe this can unite the neighborhood. Karen's gone too far, and people realize it's not just petty nitpicking. She's capable of genuine harm. Let's gather tomorrow. I'll bring some others over." Marisol thanked her, hung up, and went to console Bethany. She explained that neighbors wanted to help, that she wouldn't let Karen touch her walker again. Bethany asked in a trembling voice, "Why does she hate my pink walker?" Marisol hugged her tightly, blinking back tears. "Some people just don't understand, sweetie. But that's their problem, not yours." The next day, dozens of neighbors rallied around the Green home. They brought flowers, small gifts, and messages of support for Bethany. A few local parents organized a fundraiser, aiming to replace the damaged walker with a new one, perhaps an upgraded model. The wave of kindness overwhelmed Marisol, who realized that while Karen's cruelty was real, so was the community's capacity for compassion. Fueled by collective outrage, residents insisted on an emergency HOA board meeting to address Karen's actions. The meeting convened a few days later in a packed clubhouse. The atmosphere crackled with tension. Robert Everly, the HOA president, looked visibly uneasy as he opened the floor to testimonies. Marisol spoke first, voice steady despite the emotional weight she carried. She recounted how Karen had brazenly hurled Bethany's walker into the pond, repeating the child's cries. Onlookers, including Carlos and Heather, confirmed the story. Others pointed to phone videos capturing the aftermath, with Karen striding away from the scene while the child sobbed. The evidence was damning. Karen sat stiffly on a folding chair at the front of the room, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes scanned the crowd, which was almost unanimously hostile. When asked for an explanation, she delivered a defensive monologue. The walker was left unsupervised, it was an eyesore, and it was near community property. I was within my rights to remove it if it was offending the aesthetics of the pond area. Gasps and angry mutters rippled through the hall. Mr. Hogan, an elderly resident, stood up and shook his head in disbelief. "You assaulted a child's medical device and tossed it into water. That's not removal of property. That's vandalism. Maybe even a hate crime against a disabled child." Karen's face twitched. "It's hardly a hate crime. I was looking out for property values." Shouts erupted, many calling for Karen's immediate removal from the board. Robert Everly tried to gavel the meeting back to order. Eventually, the board announced they would hold an internal vote on Karen's position. Meanwhile, some residents pressed Marisol to file a police report for vandalism. She admitted she was considering it. The tension soared, and Karen, caught in a swell of condemnation, left abruptly, though not before throwing one last cold glare at Marisol. While the HOA deliberated on Karen's fate, the neighborhood took matters into its own hands. Within days, a crowdfunding page soared with donations, surpassing the initial goal needed for a replacement walker. People from near and far, having heard about the incident on social media, contributed. Children in the community organized a lemonade stand, proudly handing over their profits to help Bethany's walker. After consulting with Bethany, Marisol decided to purchase not just a standard replacement, but a slightly more advanced model with adjustable features. It was custom-colored in pink and turquoise swirls, evoking a playful aquatic theme. Bethany's love of the pond had inspired the design. When the new walker arrived, it sparkled with bright, glossy paint. Bethany's eyes lit up in wonder, a radiant smile replacing the fear that had lingered since the incident. "I call it Aqua Princess Walker," Bethany announced joyfully, running her hand over the swirl patterns. Marisol's heart swelled with relief. If Karen's intention had been to erase the child's offensive pink, she had instead led the community to rally around an even bolder design. Bethany embraced her new mobility device with renewed confidence, determined not to let a bully's act overshadow her freedom to explore. To ensure no repeat sabotage, the HOA, swayed by public sentiment, installed a secure storage box near the pond for assistive devices. They labeled it with a plaque reading, "Respect Access," in support of mobility for all. Parents could leave strollers or walkers safely while children fed the ducks or roamed. It was a small but significant statement. Karen's cruelty had birthed a safer environment for kids with special needs. Word of Karen's actions continued to circulate. The local newspaper ran a short piece titled, "HOA Board Member Accused of Vandalizing Disabled Child's Walker." Though the article used polite language, the condemnation was clear. Several advertisers for Hillside Oak Community's real estate flyers quietly distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with the negative press. Ironically, the very property values Karen claimed to defend were threatened by her brazen act. Amid the uproar, neighbors found solidarity. Some who rarely interacted outside of obligatory events now formed a tight network, checking on each other. They organized a small weekend celebration at the pond, dubbing it Mobility Day, inviting families to bring strollers, bikes, wheelchairs, any device that supported free movement. Bethany became an unofficial mascot, zooming around with her new swirl-patterned walker, giggling whenever a fish popped up to nibble bread from her hand. Marisol watched the transformation in awe. The community seemed more inclusive, more aware that not everyone fit a narrow aesthetic mold. Even Robert Everly, once passive, publicly apologized to Marisol for the HOA's failure to protect her daughter's rights earlier. He promised reforms in the association's rules, ensuring medical needs would never be subjected to aesthetic regulations again. Through it all, Karen fell silent, rarely appearing in public except for sporadic inspections, which she now performed with minimal interaction. Rumors suggested she was fighting behind the scenes to keep her position, but the board's censure process was ongoing. A hush of expectancy hovered. Would Karen finally be ousted? As summer gave way to early autumn, the HOA board convened one last special meeting to finalize the outcome of Karen's disciplinary review. The clubhouse was packed again. Many suspected Karen would be removed from her leadership role. Others wondered if legal charges might follow. Marisol sat in the front row with Bethany, who clutched a small plush toy shaped like a pink fish. Robert Everly addressed the crowd. "We've completed our internal investigation and considered resident statements, videos, and feedback. The board finds that Ms. Annabeth Dawson, known here as Karen, acted in a manner violating both our HOA code of conduct and any reasonable standard of human decency. We vote, by majority, to remove her from her position as vice president. Furthermore, we formally request she resign from the HOA board entirely." The audience erupted in applause. Karen stood off to the side, face tight, arms folded. She stared at Robert, disbelief and fury churning in her eyes. Yet she could do little. Her final recourse was to step away. She muttered, "You'll regret letting standards slip," then marched out, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed in the still air. A moment later, the crowd turned its attention to Marisol and Bethany. Someone shouted, "We stand with you." Others cheered, and tears welled in Marisol's eyes. The board meeting ended on a wave of relief. Karen's hold on the HOA had been broken. Outside, a cluster of neighbors formed around Bethany, congratulating her on her new walker. She beamed, demonstrating how easily it glided on the sidewalk. The swirl designs gleamed under the clubhouse lights. That night, back at home, Marisol tucked Bethany into bed, reflecting on how a single heinous act had galvanized an entire community. Instead of bowing to fear, they had chosen to champion acceptance and empathy. And as for Karen, no one knew if she would move away or remain in Hillside Oak community as a disgraced ex-official. But one truth was clear. Her attempt to erase a child's bright pink walker had only magnified its significance. Now, every stroll Bethany took radiated a gentle challenge to the neighborhood, daring them to imagine a suburban life defined not by bland uniformity, but by vibrant inclusion.